Did anybody here go to a Lester V. Pearson elementary or high school? No one? There's no, there is? Can we go back there? So there is one in London? There is? They're all across the country. I sent this top 10 list as a press release to numerous newspapers, media agencies, and had a journalist from Embassy Magazine, which is the sort of establishment, foreign policy establishment journal in Ottawa. Journalists responded to me asking me what I was talking about this last one. And I sort of laid out the case briefly about Lester Pearson and his role in the creation of a Jewish state on Palestinian land, his role in Korea, his role in 1965 invasion of the Dominican Republic, and his role in Vietnam. And I had this journalist respond to me saying, Yves, I know you're a radical, but have some pride in Canada. And that's the thinking of a professional foreign policy journalist. That's the mythology, the identity. Pearson is really the symbol of that mythology of Canada as a force for good in the world. Pearson won the Nobel Peace Prize, right, alongside the great man Henry Kissinger, right? This is what we have when we think of the mythology of Canada and the world. Pearson is it. But in fact, there's a strong case that Pearson should have spent his final days in jail as a war crime, as Chomsky believes, and I think I support. Particularly with regards to Vietnam and Canada's support for the U.S. war in Vietnam. As I mentioned earlier, Canadian aid to Vietnam that went to supporting the U.S. counterinsurgency effort in South Vietnam. The Canada allowed the U.S. to test Agents Orange and Green in New Brunswick to then go use against the Vietnamese, killing thousands and thousands of Vietnamese. And that was tested in New Brunswick because the foliage was seen as similar. Canadians who spied on the North Vietnamese for the Americans. And in probably the most famous speech of a Canadian Prime Minister supposedly standing up to American imperialism is a speech that Pearson gave in 1966 at Temple University in Philadelphia. This is cited all across the Canadian foreign policy literature as the Canadian Prime Minister standing up to American belligerents. And the rest of the speech reads, or another part of the speech reads, quote, this is Pearson speaking, "The situation cannot be expected to improve until North Vietnam becomes convinced that aggression, in whatever guise, for whatever reason, is inadmissible and will not succeed." That's not American aggression against North Vietnam or American aggression in South Vietnam. That's North Vietnamese aggression against South Vietnam. That is the thinking. That's a speech of a politician who clearly supported American objectives in Vietnam. And yet to us, this speech is lauded as a supposedly anti-war speech. But what Chomsky is referring to specifically about Canada's role, about Pearson's role as a war criminal, is Canada's role in the International Control Commission. While Pearson was Prime Minister, the International Control Commission was set up by the UN to bring peace to Vietnam. Canada was the West's representative, did all kinds of stuff in terms of supporting U.S. military buildup, as I mentioned earlier, spying on the North Vietnamese for the Americans. But Canadian officials would go from Ottawa down to Washington, where they would be briefed by the Americans on what to tell the North Vietnamese officials, including threats to bomb North Vietnamese. Threats, of course, channeled through Canada from the Americans, telling the North Vietnamese leadership, if you don't do this, we are going to bomb you. That's what they did. The U.S. bombing of North Vietnam was clearly a war crime, and Canada facilitated, supported, with Pearson as Prime Minister, that process. So, basically, I only got a couple minutes, I see, to summarize a bit of Canadian foreign policy. In my estimation, Canadian foreign policy is motivated by two things above all else. Support for empire, historically British Empire, today US Empire. And that's not support for US Empire because Washington forces Ottawa to go along with it. Sometimes yes, but for the most part because the Canadian elite, Canadian foreign policy establishment, see their interests as aligned with US imperial interests. The second main motivation of Canadian foreign policy is support for Canadian corporate interests abroad. The Canadian banks that dominate the English Caribbean, major players all across Latin America, the Canadian mining companies that all across the world, basically in every country in the world, they're involved in horribly destructive, ecologically, socially mining projects. Companies like SNC-Lavalin, the world's biggest engineering company based in Montreal, one of the world's biggest disaster capitalist corporations, which if SNC-Lavalin was based 6 hours south in Boston, would probably have a half dozen books written about all the nasty things that SNC-Lavalin has done around the world. But because it's in Canada, flies under a Canadian flag, it's able to sort of get away with a lot of this stuff. So Canadian foreign policy on a day-to-day basis, the embassies around the world, the consular officials, really working to support Canadian corporate interests, despite the social consequences, despite what happens to the indigenous community in Ecuador, in Guatemala. Certainly racism does affect Canadian foreign policy. In the case of Haiti, there was a significant dose of racism explaining Canada's role there. But above all else, support for empire and support for Canadian corporate interests. Just to conclude, the motivation for writing this book, this is not, from my standpoint, I'm not just an academic, I see this as an activist exercise. It's about social change. It's about helping to build critical consciousness in this country towards Canadian foreign policy. So we stop just believing what the politicians tell us. We stop just trusting that when they say that they're going to help the poor children of Honduras, or they say that they're helping the women of Afghanistan, that we challenge that. We force them to prove to us that that's the case. We assume the worst, because the history is the worst. The history is that Canada supports empire, supports corporate interests, does not concern itself with the interests of the population around the world, and does not even concern itself with the interests of the majority of Canadians. The majority of Canadians are almost entirely shut out from the discussions of Canadian foreign policy. It's that foreign policy establishment, the banks, the military contractors, the mining companies, the generals, and a handful of politicians who have overwhelming control over Canadian foreign policy and orient that policy in their interests, not in the interest of the majority of us, the majority of Canadians. And part of the aim of this book is to help democratize Canadian foreign policy. So Canadian foreign policy is no longer controlled or dominated by the small elite, that we start taking what our country, our politicians, military, aid dollars, NGOs, corporations are doing around the world seriously. And we orient that in a way that serves our interests and that serves the majority of interests of the population around the world. The goal is ultimately to build a more just world. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.